Okay, so my goal with this, actually, is not so much to tell you exactly how to bootstrap Puppet or deploy your applications. It's more to give you a number of ideas as to how you could leverage Puppet, Rake, Fabric, if you know what Fabric is. If not, I'll tell you. To use these things to integrate into your existing architecture and improve it. So, here we go. Purpose of Puppet. Now, you might say, like, well, we've been in PuppetConf all day. We know what Puppet does. Like, that's why we're here. That's why we paid the money, right? But, so that's not what I'm after. What I'm after here is what problems are you particularly trying to solve in your environment? Like, what pain points do you have? Do you have a whole bunch of problems already existing in your infrastructure that you're trying to remediate? Or do you have a known good configuration that you're trying to improve upon? In other words, are your servers a mess? If they are, Puppet can help, right? That's what it's for. But it'll take a little bit of work, and deploying it might be a little bit trickier than it would be otherwise. So, then what are your platforms? Are you a Windows shop? If so, Puppet may not even be the right tool for you, because that's not its specialty. Are you a Unix shop? Do you have a whole bunch of old Soares machines? That might also be a little bit tricky to get going. So, this is the best case, right? You have new servers, they're shiny, they're uniform, everything's good, you have no problems. All your teams are on the same page, right? You don't have any differing requirements, let's say, or teams that are bickering about how they want to implement stuff. And you only have one operating system, so deployment should be a cinch, right? A little bit idealistic, maybe. If not, then I envy you. Reality, it strikes. There's no baseline config. Everybody, you know, you've had a sysadmin team where you've had 5 different members over the past 10 years, and each one has had their own unique brand of management, right? And so your sysconfig files might be a little bit different. Your DNS might not even be working properly. NTP, like, do your servers keep time? I don't know. And then the teams, like, they have differing requirements, right? That's how this happened in the first place, is they were all trying to make it work the best that they could in the way that they cared about. But that doesn't mean that they made it work in the way that everybody else cared about. So, and then finally, you have multiple operating systems where you have, maybe you have some old Ubuntu versions, maybe some old Soares versions, some CentOS, Red Hat, Debian, SUSE, Gentoo. Like, there are a lot of distros out there, and building Ruby and getting Puppet running might be a little bit of a challenge depending on what you have. So, divergent needs, right? You have different groups. You have development group. They care about deploying their code, really. They don't really care about the hardware or the base OS. They care about getting their application up and running. And they care about idempotence, right? They care about having a repeatable, reliable solution to deploy their code where they can deploy it 50 times if someone hits the enter key too many times. And it'll be good. Everything will work out. Sysadmins, however, they care about your system configuration. You care about, you know, your sysconfig, your DNS, your NTP, all of that stuff, as well as your passwords and user management between them, right? Your UID, GID is set up so that when you port applications over, it works with the right user. All of that. So, and then finally, you have the security and the management side. So, I was a senior sysadmin. I switched to the security side because I get to help our developers write more secure code, and that's a necessary thing in today's world. But security, you care about firewalls, right? Because the inside is the new outside. There are threats everywhere, and you want to stop them before they get to you. So with Puppet, you can do things like have ERB templating, where you have a base firewall config that can be globally deployed, but using facts, which I'll talk about in a little bit, you can actually deploy little snippets of your firewalls so that each of your servers has its own unique configuration, or at least your tiers and types of servers have their own unique configuration. Then, moreover, your management and security, both of these care about auditability, compliance, reporting, this kind of stuff, so that you can track your changes, your revisions, your versions, so that when something bad happens, should it happen, whether it's a misconfiguration or hopefully nothing more malicious than that, you at least know what happened and when and where, right? And who did it, hopefully. And so that way you know how to fix it. So lastly, you have different operating systems. As I mentioned, you have Debian maybe, you have Red Hat, you have Ubuntu. Each of these, they have different packages. If you have Solaris, like that has a whole different package system than any of the Linux variants, right? Because it's Unix. It's not even the same X, I guess. So Windows, if you have Windows, you probably have a whole bunch of different generations of Windows, right? Like maybe going back to Server 2000, maybe even NT, depending how old your hardware is, up through Server 2012 if you've been doing well with it. So, decision time. You're getting Puppet. What do you do? Do you go open source or enterprise? Enterprise has shiny bits, right? But it costs money. Either way, you should test before you commit. Make sure, just use some Puppet applies, get used to the syntax, make sure it's a tool you even want. I'm assuming it is because you're here. But either way, you should test before you get too deeply into the waters. If you have those older systems like Solaris, Puppet Enterprise greatly eases deployment. Like personally, I was faced with the choice of, do I want to build Solaris Ruby on Spark, on x86, 32-bit and 64-bit versions, as well as Ubuntu, Red Hat, all these different servers. And personally, as a person who was going to deploy that, like, no, I'd way rather spend the money if it came out of my own paycheck than like spend the weeks to build all that stuff, right? It just saves some time. Lastly, if you have 10 servers or less, and you're just a small shop, like use Enterprise. It's free. Like you don't even have to get into licensing until you get bigger than that. So you might as well take the ease of use that comes with that. So open source, as I said, it's free. You may not have support, but you do have a very valuable user community who's helpful. There are IRC rooms, which I've heard today that someone was like, I had a problem, and then I went on IRC and I was amazed. Like there were Puppet Labs employees, and they helped out, and the users were fantastic, and my problem was solved in no time. And like even the Puppet employees checked in later to make sure I had been taken care of. And I was just on their IRC. I'm not even a client. So open source, it's still useful. It's still great. And then they have Foreman, which is sort of like the Puppet Enterprise dashboard, only different, right? Because it's open source. And it is complex in its own way, but it's also powerful in its own way. Lastly, again, free. You can't really argue with that, right? No dollar signs. Puppet Enterprise, why would you go with that? If you have all of these nice things, you have a dashboard with Foreman, you have a user community for support, well, with Puppet Enterprise, you get an integrated dashboard, right? You have auditability and reporting and compliance information at a glance. You have the facts listed for you. You have the server status at a glance, whether anything's gone wrong or everything's great, right? Like, I have a saying back in my company where it's like, if you see redness, bad. If there's any red, that's bad. If you see blue, that's good. That means it changed something, and hopefully that was a good change. And if it's green, then you're golden, right? You don't even have to worry about it. Like, oh, great, dashboard's green. It's been green for a week. Sweet. There's no problem. Lastly, it has mcollective integration for the live management console. So that allows you to do things as simple as just like Puppet run once, which normally you would have to go on each server and say, yes, please reapply this so that I can see what I just ran, make sure it works, make sure I didn't have any problems. So having that integrated, even just that aspect, and there are a lot more tools, right? You can restart services from the live management console. You can do, with a plugin, which I'll talk about a little bit later, you can actually add custom facts, which you can then use to target your modules. So you can kind of redeploy on the fly if you have to re-architect a little bit. And there are pre-built Solaris and Linux packages, which seems at the first like that's kind of a little thing, right? Like you can build Ruby, that's possible. Like you know how, but do you want to? That's the question. Like personally, I'm a lazy guy. I don't want to do this stuff if I don't have to. If it's done for me, then fantastic. Lastly, you have support. Because if you're in an enterprise, if you have a few hundred servers out there, and maybe you have your developers using this to deploy their applications, if they can't deploy a critical fix when the application is down, because maybe your Puppet master had too many logs and the root partition filled up and all of a sudden it's not deploying new code, like, that's bad. And if you don't know how to fix that, having someone you can call and who you pay to fix this for you is a nice to have. So, I mean, that's kind of the argument for support in general, right? Whether it's hardware or software, but Puppet is exceptionally good at that, having used them once or twice myself. So that's kind of the prelude to what this talk is actually about, right? So now you have Puppet, you've chosen your poison, whether it's enterprise or open source. And now how do you get it deployed on these servers that are maybe not quite perfect? So, what's your architecture? By that I mean your system's architecture as a whole. Do you have a whole bunch of tiers of architecture? Do you have a flat hierarchy where all of your servers are production and they're all in the same subnet? How many Puppet masters do you want to have? Are you good with one? Do you want all your servers to report to one Puppet master? So if you deploy one module, it goes everywhere? Or do you want to have a few so you can test it out beforehand? Do you want to replicate your Puppet masters? So in case your production Puppet master, assuming you're using one in production in different tiers, in case that goes down, then you can fail over and be good. Well, that's excellent, but it's a little bit harder to get working, actually, than you would hope. And lastly, automation tools. Are you using one? Have you heard of Fabric or Capistrano? Yes, it's useful. It's excellent. I highly recommend it, and I'll talk about it a little bit later. So here's a suggestion. I know I said I wouldn't give you the way to do things, but so here's just an idea, and feel free to disagree and make your own way with yourself. So my suggestion is to have one master per tier. So assuming you have a tiered architecture, you have a development environment, a production environment, have one master in each. So that way you can step up your modules just like you would have your developers step up their code, right? Have replication in production if possible. It's a nice to have. It's a little bit of a bear to get rolling. I mean, it really is. You do have to go through some hoops, even if you're using Puppet Enterprise, sorry to say. But it's a good thing to have in general, right? Failover, all that stuff. Have a lab to experiment on your own. Because even if you have a development environment with its own Puppet master, for you as a sysadmin, or assuming you are a sysadmin, or whoever is managing the Puppet deploy, you have a production uptime requirement. Because if your developers are using the Puppet master to deploy their code, even on a development tier, if they can't do that, it's like a production outage for them because it's a work stoppage issue, right? They can't work anymore until you get it fixed. So having a lab where you're testing, let's say, a DNS module, where your developers don't care at all, right? That's just for your back-end system to make sure it's working properly. But if you deploy the wrong DNS to all of your servers and they're trying to use the wrong server to look up all their hosts, everything's going to break. So you want to have something to test that on, especially something to test it on every single one of your different operating systems. So one Solaris, if you have some Solaris. If you have x86 and Spark, hopefully you'll have even one of those to test on, right? Because the architectures are subtly different. And so even though your module in Puppet is built to kind of abstract this from you, it doesn't always work perfectly. And sometimes you have to have kind of, well, if Solaris, do this. If Linux, do that. And so having a kind of playground for you where it's a sandbox, you can break it as badly as you want it. Hopefully it's virtualized, so if it's totally broken, you can just redeploy it, right? And like, whoa, that was terrible. Well, forget about that. We'll take care of that later. Lastly, you want source control for your manifests. Because let's say your Puppet master goes belly up. Fini, it's no longer there. Like, who knows, maybe the hard drive died that it was on, and then you have no master anymore. Well, if you didn't have source control for your manifests are lost. And all those man hours that went into them for your developers, for your sysadmins, that's all gone, right? So source control is good. I mean, in general, you should have that for your code, but treat the modules as if you're a developer deploying code, because that's really what it is. Your system configuration is now code. So I talked earlier a little bit about a tiered infrastructure. So my recommendation would be at least have two. Just have two. Like if you only have 10 servers, have at least a couple of them be production, where your developers can go hog wild and it won't destroy your production, right? It won't take down the website that your clients pay you with, because that sucks. So more tiers are a little bit better, right? If you have a test tier, a QA tier, that's a nice clone of your production environment that maybe your developers have slightly reduced access to, right? It's not quite as free-for-all as a development environment. Then that helps you to expose your problems, whether it's problems in your modules or problems in your application code that you're deploying. So either way, you know, this is helpful in general for deployment practices for software, but it's also just as useful for deployment practices for Puppet modules. So the introduction to automation. What is Fabric? What is Capistrano? Why are we using these tools? Well, so let's say you have 200 servers, 250 servers, 400 servers. Do you want to be installing Puppet? Even if it's Puppet Enterprise and you have this nice package built for you, do you really want to be going on each of these servers and manually typing in all that info 400 times? Do you think you'll do that without a typo? Do you think you'll remember which server you typed incorrectly? So when you're looking at all the consoles and trying to figure out which server isn't showing up, like, will you be able to even find that server, or will you just have one lonely server not getting its updates, and you'll find out later when a needed update happens and it breaks, right? So using an automation tool allows you to deploy to all these servers in a small fraction of the time. So this is an example of Fabric. I like Fabric. I started programming with Python because I like Python. So init.py, what this is it's basically your inventory list for your Fabric modules. So you have import fab puppet deploy. All that's saying is this fab puppet deploy.py, this Python file, stick that in. So when I do fab whatever, that'll show up. Or you can do fab list, right? And it'll show your modules that you have in Fabric. And this is an example of your deployment file. Now, it's a very truncated example. It's not very useful as it is, but this is just to show you, like, it's not a scary thing to use automation. It's actually pretty easy. You have one variable, env.hosts. That's where you have your list of servers that you're going to. So if you have this module, and just this module, you can even hard code that in that module and say your env.hosts are this list of servers. And then, okay, you import your Fabric API. Great. Then you set a task. So that you use that, what's called a decorator in Python, this @task. Set default equals true. What that means is, instead of having to say, you know, fab puppet deploy dot deploy puppet, whatever, setting the default equals true, what that does is that lets you just say fab puppet deploy, full stop. And that's the default task that it does. So it's just like save your fingers some wear and tear. Then this is, again, some default values, right? Tier is dev, as in this would be to deploy to your development tier so that you don't accidentally deploy for production by leaving it default. So you don't accidentally overwrite your Puppet and maybe have it set the wrong master, what have you. And then uninstall equals false, because I'm assuming that in this task, this is where you would shoot over your Puppet Enterprise module or lack thereof. And so you don't necessarily want to uninstall it if it's not installed already, right? So that would be your default. Maybe you do want that module to handle uninstalls and reinstalls, so you would have that value. So automating it, as I said, Fabric, Capistrano, use answers files. So what answers files are when you're installing Puppet Enterprise, for example, you can use a -a. This -a lets you reference an answers file. So it basically allows you to do an unattended install. So you don't have to sit there and manually re-enter all that stuff. You can check, make sure it's good, then deploy it to all your servers, save yourself some time. And then expect unexpected problems. Even if you think you have a uniform architecture, you don't. Like, it just doesn't happen. I wish I did. Like, one thing, do you have sudo on all your boxes? No. You might think you do, because who doesn't, right? It's been there forever. But you might even run into some old boxes that don't have it, which runs into some really interesting problems when you have automation tools like Fabric, which assume the use of sudo. You know, you log in with an unprivileged user, and then you sudo up to do your install, because Puppet needs root. Oh, I don't know what just happened there. Okay, here we go. So this is an example answers file. So fail an unsuccessful master lookup. That means if when you're installing you can't contact your Puppet master, you probably did something wrong. So you want it to fail, right? You don't want it to say, yeah, we're hunky-dory, we're good, and then just not have it report in. You want it to install. This Puppet cloud install thing, that's a cloud provisioner. It's used for Amazon Web Services, for VMware, that sort of thing. You don't need that unless you're starting to use that. And even then, you only need like one. Your Puppet Enterprise console, again, that and the further down, the Puppet CA install and Puppet Master install, you don't want those unless you're using this to install your Puppet Master, right? When you're installing it on all your client boxes, all you want are the symlinks, the agent, The symlinks are just, so you can use command line, what have you. And lastly, the vendor packages install, I believe, is used, although I haven't verified this, so I could be misleading you, with Ubuntu and Debian, which have it in their default repo. Like if you use vendor packages install, then it'll pull from there. But personally, my feeling is like you want to have as uniform an environment as possible, right? So even if you have vendor packages, if some of your machines don't, then I would say don't do that. Okay, so now it's installed. You've configured it everywhere. It's working, hopefully. If it's not working, I guess a little bit more time. Now we're ready to deploy our applications, get our developers in on the sysadmin goodness, right? So, overview, source control integration. Now, this is something that you should be doing with your modules as well as with the rest of your code, as I touched on a little bit earlier. Now, you don't have to do it well. And what I mean by that is you don't have to use anything fancy. There are a bunch of fancy tools, which a bunch of other speakers are talking about today. But you don't have to use those yet. When you're just starting out, use Bash. Use whatever you already know to get going, right? And then leverage the Rake API if you're using a Puppet Enterprise. So this is one early approach you could use, for example. You could have one deploy task file, which is text. It's just a little list of your packages to deploy and the tagged version as the version is tagged in Git, Subversion, whatever you're using. You have another file that has just the Rake commands to update your Puppet groups, and a third to update your nodes and add those nodes to those groups. Now, you could say, well, why have those in separate files? Why not just have one file that has both of those, right? Because it's the same Rake commands. Like, why would you split them out? Well, you split them out because if you try to add nodes to non-existent groups, it fails, right? And so do you want to have resource ordering problems where you have to remember which you do? Like, I try to make sure that I don't have to remember things when I do this stuff. So it's like if I have step 1, step 2, step 3, it makes it easy for me. So this is the source control workflow, right? So let's say you update a module. Every time you update a module and you're about to deploy it to something, tag it off. Because if that turns out to be a stable version and you want to deploy that elsewhere, you want to have the ability to go back and deploy it elsewhere, right? And that way you can have a tag to reference. So then you update your deploy task file. Again, check that in. Make sure that deploy task file is also tagged off. You check it out, and you have a helper script, maybe Bash or Perl or Python or Ruby or whatever you feel like using, that will take that module and deploy it over the old. Maybe you can even have that back up your old modules. So if something breaks terribly on production, you at least have a backup modules directory and you can go, oops, that was terrible, back up, right? So this is an introduction to Rake. If you're not familiar with it, it's a build tool. It's sort of similar to Make or Ant. It has Rake files, which are basically Make files, only Ruby, because Ruby redoes things in Ruby. Standard Ruby syntax, it's not that bad. You can create multi or single-use tasks. With multi-use tasks, there's actually, with Puppet Enterprise, there's a folder for your Rake tasks. So you can make reusable things. So the format is like the namespace and then the task. So you can create all sorts of fancy tools and use that as sort of a pseudo-automation tool in and of itself. So tips. Read the API documentation. It changes occasionally. They've been pretty good about updating it recently. There's been a few things. There have been a few things added in 3.0. This is a command prefix. So it's long. I mainly put that here because you're going to see it a lot in the next few slides, and I don't want it to distract you. Like, this is just the default path to the Rake file that you're using in order to reference all the other libraries and modules that Rake needs in order to execute whatever task you're using. Then set your Rails environment. By default, Puppet uses production for pretty much everything useful. So you can just set it to production either in your bash RC file so that you don't have to remember to enter it every time if you're doing Rake tasks from the command line, or in your script if you're saving these off and tagging them as I was suggesting. So this is an example. Update your Puppet groups, right? This is, so you create your classes. That's the namespace, node class. The task is add. The name that you want to add is user's permission. So maybe you have a Puppet module named users, which handles all your users and passwords and that kind of thing. Then you have their permissions. So maybe the directory permissions that those users are allowed to have. And you want that added as a class so that you can add it to groups later. Likewise, you have a packages module with a provisioner submodule. And that provisioner submodule, who knows what it does, right? It could provision any of your applications, but you want it added to the console so you can reference it in other groups. So these are the groups, right? So now you have a group. You're just adding a blank group, empty, nothing in it, named provisioner. And you add those classes that you just added. Node group add class. So you'll notice instead of node class.add, it's node group add class, right? So that's a different namespace with a different task within that namespace. So you add provisioner, right? So that's targeting the group you just created. And then adding the class users permissions. And then the same thing with the class of packages provisioner. So you're adding those two classes that you just created to the group that you just created. So now you have a group that if you add nodes to, they'll actually get something useful, hopefully. So and here's an example of another file with update nodes, right? Again, I'm setting the Rails environment to production at the top. So that way Rake has all that it needs. Then you add the nodes to the group. So in this example, it's pro1, right? So maybe you have a bunch of servers named pro whatever because they're your provisioner nodes. So pro1, and you add that to default and provisioner. And then pro2, maybe that has a slightly different configuration. Maybe that's a backup server that gets some extra group that the other one doesn't get, right? So there's a subtle problem here, which I touch on here, which is a group list has to be complete. You can't do an incremental addition using Rake tasks at the moment, and I talked to the Puppet guys and confirmed this today. You still can't, and they have no plans on supporting this. So if you're adding nodes to groups this way, which I do recommend, because this is how you can have a versioned, like historically accurate, auditable system, right, for managing your nodes. You have to be really careful when you add your groups, because if you miss one, it'll just not be in that anymore. And maybe that won't get packages that you expect it to. So you have to be very careful, make sure that you look to see what groups it's in before you deploy. And there's another kind of compounding problem with that, where it's kind of hard to get the list of groups that a node is in unless you look it up through the console and actually see it and kind of eyeball it. So that's kind of the biggest glaring point that you'll probably screw up at one point, is removing your node from a group accidentally. So directory ownership, that's another kind of issue, which is PE-admin is a Puppet Enterprise user that people tend to use to manage a Puppet modules directory. Puppet dashboard, however, is a user that does all the Rake stuff. So how do you reconcile that? Like, do you give the PE-admin user SU privileges to use a Puppet dashboard account? So that way you can just switch off here and there or have that scripted up. Like, however you solve that is up to you. You could use a custom user and try to redirect all the permissions that go elsewhere into that custom user. I wouldn't recommend that, because that's a recipe for disaster when you try to upgrade, right? And then maybe they add a new group or a new user or a new directory even that you weren't taking into account when you originally had your script to do all that. The Rake API can be improved. Like nested groups, for example. Let's say you have an Apache server. Maybe you have a few Apache servers. You have a web internal for your internal users, and you have an external group out in your DMZ. Well, you both want them to get Apache, right? In fact, they probably have pretty much exactly the same packages with the exception of some firewalls, rules, and that sort of thing. But you can't do that in Puppet Enterprise through the Rake commands. You can do it through the console, but not through Rake commands unless you're using 3.0 or above. Luckily, that's released. So as long as you're using that version, you're good. So there's also a problem with access control. And I don't know how Foreman handles this, or else I would speak to that. But I know in the Puppet Enterprise version, there is no way to limit your individual live management commands. Like, let's say you just want your developers to be able to do Puppet run once, right? To make sure that when they deploy their code, they can reset it themselves. They don't have to bug the sysadmin team. There's no way to do that right now. They either have admin access or they have, access to the reassign nodes to groups and things, but no live management access, or they have no access at all. So if you want them to be able to restart from the console, they can do everything. So you have to be very careful with who you grant like lordship over your production domains, right? You can use development environment, maybe give a bunch of your developers so they can learn the tool, but access control, I hear, is coming in the next, well, they wouldn't give me a time frame, but they said they're working on it, that it's the biggest problem they currently know of. So and then targeting. So let's say you have modules, right? Like the firewall module I mentioned earlier, where you have different templates that you want to deploy to different servers. How do you do that? How do you do it properly and efficiently? Well, you can use custom facts, especially using a plugin called Etsy Facts, which I'll cover more in a minute. And then you can also use Hiera to do things with user management, password management, make sure you're doing a Hiera lookup in YAML files, which are these kind of loosely structured Ruby-ish files to get the values. Think of it here as kind of a key value store that's easier to use, essentially. So these are your next steps, right? So now that you have it running, you have your developers starting to run, start with the easy tasks first, right? Don't bite off everything yet. Start with the problems that you know you have that are relatively easy to start biting off. Maybe it's NTP, because you know all that is like one line, right? And so you can start with that. That's simple. It'll get you going. And just build incrementally from there. Use the Etsy Facts plugin if you are using Puppet Enterprise, because you can have the live management console and make it much more useful with the ability to add these custom facts and have things retarget just from the console itself. Just select all your groups, add the fact you want, and you're done. You're good. As long as you have a module that references it, just like you would reference any other fact, it'll work. Hiera, useful. Again, key value store, users, passwords, permissions, all that sort of stuff. You can do a lookup in YAML. Just make sure your hierarchy isn't too huge. And then you could graduate to using something like an RPM repository for your deployment of packages, where instead of manually deploying these applications and having your pre and post steps in these long Puppet manifests or in scripts that you execute prior and post, you can just package an RPM and make sure all those things are already in there. So with Puppet, then you can use a built-in package management and say, ensure latest. So anytime you upload a new version to your RPM repository, it'll just come down properly. And you don't have to worry about any of that. Anyway, so thank you for your time. I hope this was helpful, at least some of you. So now I think we have a few minutes for questions. If you have, yes, please. And I think if you can make it to the microphone, please do. Otherwise,
yes, I may have missed when you were showing the answers file, whether there was a declaration.
Would you like me to go back to that?
There's a declaration for cert name.
So the cert name by default will be the name of the agent that you're on. So the question was, is there a way to set the cert name in the answers file so that maybe it doesn't match up directly with the server? I would recommend just using your server name, because the host name should be unique anyway. And that way, when something goes wrong with that server, you'll have an easy way to reference it.
So by default, it takes the...
By default, it takes the server name itself, yeah, the host name. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Anybody? No? All right. Well, thank you very much. I think we have a few minutes until the next talk, so feel free to move about the cabin, as they would say in the aircraft parlance.